On last week's program, I talked a little bit about how we need to rethink, I should say, our approach toward disaster recovery. And our next guest had another take on that same issue, going at it from a somewhat different angle. So I thought it would be good to have him on, especially since we have seen the devastation of Hurricane Irma through to its mostly completion since then. So here to join us now is Ryan Cooper. Ryan is a national correspondent at theweek.com. We've had him on before, a big supporter of his work and of his work on this topic. So Ryan, thanks for coming back on the program.
And thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. So briefly, rather than me paraphrasing your writing, what did we learn, or what should we learn from Hurricane Irma about how we handle disaster relief?
Yeah, well, it's not just Irma, it's also Harvey, and then possibly Jose as well, that's going to come and hit somewhere in the United States too. But the basic problem is that they have this pile of money that they allocate to FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, every year, that is just totally inadequate to the amount needed to actually handle disasters. And almost every year for the last decade, they have to go back to Congress to get another, handout, and that's happened again this year. By the time, Harvey floodwaters weren't even receding, and they had already used up almost their entire, I think it's like $6.5 billion that appropriated for the 2017 fiscal year. And before Irma even hit, they were almost out of money, and they were having to triage their relief efforts. And so just in that sort of narrow point, I suggested that, what you could do was have a much, much larger appropriation. Theoretical appropriation, you might say, of up to, for example, $200 billion that they could just tap into as needed. And so you wouldn't have to go hat in hand to Congress and ask for more money because, number one, Congress is really slow at doing things, even if it is an emergency. And number two, sometimes they're in recess, for weeks and weeks. And so, it's unwise to count on Congress being able to act quickly in case of a huge disaster. And so these guys ought to just have, a big line of credit that they can tap into whenever something big hits. That was my, sort of policy innovation that I would, in terms of funding disaster relief.
So before we move on to that, because I took note of that, and there are a couple questions that come up. One is obviously, why don't we do that? Why wouldn't we just budget a reasonable amount, knowing that these disasters are likely to happen, and if the money's not spent, it's rolled over to the next year or what have you? Is it that we don't, is it climate denialism? Is it just general, we're in denial about the fact that these disasters occur? Is it that Republicans hate spending money and they control Congress? Is it all of the above? What do you think?
I think it's a combination of those two tendencies. So number one, the way that they have calculated the need for disaster money at FEMA is based on this historical average going back decades. And now they are not allowed to use anything having to do with climate change in regards to President Obama had this executive order that he was going to say any construction projects that were built using federal money were going to have to take into account somewhat nebulous thing, but they're going to have to take into account climate change before they could get their money, which could implicate, people who are building, accessing, for example, the federal flood insurance program, which is also run by FEMA, and being, building in what may have been a, fairly flood safe zone, but no longer is due to the number of extreme weather events we're, have been having and are going to continue to see probably even more of in the future. Trump rescinded that. And in general, just even before, under Obama, they had not been really dealing with the fact that the world has become much more risky in general. And so, it was just like, oh, Hurricane Sandy hit, and you just do this one big one-off thing without doing a really structural look at, like, what do we actually need to do to prepare, in terms of funding, in terms of, rebuilding infrastructure and increasing resilience. And then, of course, as you say, the general Republican trend of not spending money on anything that has to do with the federal government, except for subsidies for oil companies and stuff like that. Just Trump's budget, written by his guy, Mick Mulvaney, cut all sorts of stuff out of FEMA. They cut the EPA, which does a lot of disaster relief stuff, and they cut the Chemical Hazard and Safety Board. I think that's what it's called. It's a federal, just one of those little federal agencies that looks at chemical spills that happen. And they're, as Trump was proposing that they be wound down forever, they were looking at, as you've probably seen in the news, there were all of these horrible chemical spills that happened during Harvey because there's so many chemical factories and refineries down there, and they all got flooded, or a lot of them did.
You had benzene released
disaster.
you had benzene released into the atmosphere. You had all of the above. It's striking because as you were talking, and again, we're talking with Ryan Cooper of The Week about disaster relief, something we're going to have to get a lot better at than we are right now. You'd think that it would be impossible for Republicans to defend the idea of cutting funding for helping people recover from disaster. But I remember that when Hurricane Sandy happened and the Texas Republican delegation led by Ted Cruz was leading the way in resisting the full funding for disaster relief for Sandy, they kept saying, well, it's not really for disaster relief because some of it's to mitigate future disasters and some of it is really, infrastructure, as if rebuilding infrastructure wasn't valid. So they kind of obfuscated and clouded the issue and basically tried to change the subject. Should Democrats, in your opinion, be more aggressive about saying these guys not only deny climate change, but they don't want to help Americans recover from tragedy?
Yeah, it certainly is pretty striking to see, in many cases, those exact same people who are voting against Hurricane Sandy relief just begging for money from the government, on handed knee, which they got as part of that big extra supplemental, because it was finally them who were, this is always the Republican mantra towards any sort of government help. It's like, nobody should get it except for me,
right,
when I need it. But I the question of ideology is an interesting one. And I'm not, it is pretty hard to understand where, to know exactly how you could overcome these sorts of resistances from conservatives who disbelieve in climate change or skeptical of the government. And it seems like, the most reliable method to get Republican votes is when their own houses are underwater. It reminds me also of the story of one of those vaccine denier people who had a sudden change of tune when her and all 7 of her children were infected with whooping cough. So you know, you will hope these disasters kind of will have an effect on people's kind of basic reasoning to think that, like, you know, really, you know, you just cannot avoid the conclusion that things are getting worse. But I would estimate that no matter what you did, there will always be a hardcore of reactionaries that will vote against anything having to do with climate change. And so you're just going to have to win power at the state and federal level and just steamroll their objections. Be like, we're upgrading your highways whether you want to or not, and just going to have to live with it.
Well, that's always where I come out that, yeah, maybe you can convert a few of them when it is their house underwater. Maybe that's a good time to bring some of these things up for a vote. But of course, Democrats don't even have the power to do that at the national level or in 2/3 of state houses. So my attitude is, well, you know, maybe disaster relief is another one of those issues that can be used to hammer Republicans so that rather than try to persuade them, they can just be kicked out of power.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, at least, you know, I don't think you could, you know, vote against disaster appropriations, but I think you can really, you know, to the extent that they really are unwilling to fund, you know, especially when it's blue states getting hammered. I think you could use that as a pretty effective attack to say, like, they're literally letting the country fall apart. You know, it's kind of like, you know, imagine if in World War II, you know, the after the Pearl Harbor attack, all the Republicans in Congress were like, oh, this is fake news from the FDR administration. They made this up. This is not a real attack. It's false flag, you know, Alex Jones stuff. Like, you know,
yeah,
pretty effective attacks, you know, just in terms of, like, you know, quote unquote national security, that you're literally letting the country drown because you can't, you know, accept the kind of consensus of climate science.
Well, maybe Democrats will get on board with our recommendations because, of course, what Democrats really need to do is listen to us. I think we can agree on that. Unfortunately, Ryan Cooper, we're going to have to leave it there. But Ryan Cooper, national correspondent for The Week, thanks for writing this piece. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.